Hello. So we're going to get started. Today we're going to cover signals and explanatory parentheticals. We're covering signals because hopefully for your final close memorandum, you will attempt to use them. They are important in legal writing because you are just being introduced to them today. I'm not going to grade your signals for your final close memorandum, but they will be graded on your final open memorandum. But I want you to get used to using them and start using them properly because they're important. As far as explanatory parentheticals, I know we covered them briefly before your discussion section was due, but now we're going to give the full lecture, and you are expected to use explanatory parentheticals and use them properly for your final close memorandum. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is signals. We use signals, as hopefully you saw in your writing, to describe the relationship of the case or legal authority that you are citing and the point that you are using that authority to support. In other words, does the authority that you're citing exactly state the point that you're trying to make? Does the authority that you're citing merely suggest the point that you're making without actually saying that point? Does the authority generally stand for the proposition that you're making without ever mentioning the proposition specifically? Or does the authority stand in opposition to the proposition that you're trying to make? These are all shown just by putting a signal in front of your case site. So, as the blue book showed you, we have signals that indicate support. We have signals that indicate a useful comparison. We have signals that indicate contradiction. And we have signals that indicate background material. If you are going to use more than one signal because you have more than one case in your citation, you need to use those signals in the order that they appear on this list. If you are using signals of the same type, meaning that you are going to use all signals that indicate support, when you separate your case citations and put another signal in front of your second cite, they are separated by a semicolon. If you are going to use different types of signals, you need to end the sentence of the one type of signal you're using. Say you cited a case and then a second case in support. You end that sentence with a period before you move on to the next type of signal. Say you want to add a but C because there's a case that directly contradicts what you're saying. That would start a new sentence, and then the signal, of course, would be capitalized. So we're going to go through all of the signals that indicate support. The first one is no signal at all. When you don't have a signal in front of a case that actually tells the reader something, it tells the reader three things. It can tell the reader that the case stands directly for the proposition that you are making. Here in Garcetti, the court specifically said something that the writer paraphrased. The First Amendment does not protect a public employee's speech when that speech is made pursuant to the employee's job duties. Or if you are quoting directly from a case, here's a quote from Looney: a property owner owes the greatest duty of cares to his invitees. Since it is a direct quote, you don't need a signal. The third time that you don't need a signal is when you actually use the name of the case inside your sentence. So here we have, in Chikora, the suspect's eye color and facial hair did not match the witness's description of the burglar. So since they used Chikora in the sentence, they did not need a signal when they talked about the case. Please note, as an aside, it is very odd for a reader if you start talking about a case before you've introduced the case. So hopefully there was a preceding sentence in number 3 that talked about Chikora first. The next signal would be E period G period. And that means that the cited authority is representative of or an example of many authorities that stand for the same proposition. And you don't want to cite a whole lot of cases. You use this when the cited authority states the proposition, but a multitude of other cases also say the exact same proposition, and citation to those would not be helpful. So, for an example, here you have, although all communication may not be excluded from a public forum, content-neutral regulations may be enforced if they are reasonable and narrowly tailored to serve significant government interests and leave open ample alternative channels of communications. So here you have an E period, G period, and it cites to Perry, and it also cites to Clark. That means that those cases are indicative of several cases that support the proposition that it was stated for. Note that for the majority of these examples, I'm using underlining just so that you can see it better. And so you can see that with most of these signals, the comma is not italicized or underlined. So that's why that's why the cases are underlined. You can also use C, comma, E period, G period, and that would mean that the case doesn't stand directly for the proposition, but that the cases indicate that proposition. The next signal that indicates support is C. You use C when an authority clearly supports but does not directly state the point that you are making. Sorry, basically that means that the authority implicitly supports your point, but doesn't come out and say your point. It is often helpful when you are using C to have an explanatory parenthetical at the end as a way to support why you think that case supports the point that you're making. So I'll show you. So here we have wearing symbolic clothing is a type of speech and is protected under the First Amendment. And you have the signal C, and they're citing to the case of Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District. In that case, students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. So the reader puts in a parenthetical the facts of that case to help explain how they got to the point that they were trying to make. If you were going to have a short cite, as if you had already talked about Tinker before, you could put C space id at 72. Note that the id would be a lowercase id because the C is the capital letter that starts the sentence. We also have C also. You use C also when the cited authority supports the proposition, in addition to the authority previously cited for the same proposition. So usually C also is not standalone. You had a C first, or you had a regular citation first, and C also follows. You also use C also to indicate that you do not intend to talk about that case any further. It is merely there as additional support. And again, it is recommended that you follow a C also with a parenthetical explanation, just so the reader knows what the case is about. Then we have accord. You use accord when two or more authorities state or clearly support the proposition, but the text only refers to one. So here you have, just like we had with Chikora with no signal, here you have a sentence that starts with, as the court noted in Heffron. So it mentions the case, and you will see at the end of that quote, Heffron is cited. You use accord because now you're talking about another case that wasn't part of the sentence. Basically, you're saying this case agrees with the case that I just mentioned in the previous sentence. Then you have compare. You use this when the cited authority supports the stated proposition only by analogy. If you're going to use CF, you have to have an explanatory parenthetical after it, or else the reader will never understand it. So here you have, given the extensive involvement, both administratively and financially, of the diocese within the diocesan schools, the diocese constitutes another school system for purposes of Title IX. You see the CF, you see the site, and now you have an explanatory parenthetical finding that hospital was not affiliated with university for purposes of Title IX, where then you have a quote, the two entities have no institutional affiliation. There is no written agreement binding the two entities in any way. No staff are shared and no funds are circulated between them. So as I said when we started this whole thing, when you use signals, if you're going to use a string cite, which means you're going to have multiple cases in one citation sentence, you need to pay attention to not only the order, but the capitalization and the punctuation. So as you see in this cite here, it starts with a C to Cassell. It's followed by a semicolon because C also is still part of a signal that indicates agreement. Note that because it's following a semicolon and not a period, that it is lowercase because you still are within the same sentence. And you have C also, and then you have the case Wildcats. It has an explanatory parenthetical, and then it ends with a period. Next, we're going to talk about signals that indicate contradiction. I have no idea why my slide just did that, but that's okay. We'll just talk about but C first. So but C is cited authority that clearly supports a proposition contrary to the main proposition. So if you were going to use C, if you were going to cite a case that it's direct opposite, you would use but C. So here we have this circuit generally uses the term adverse employment action and tangible employment action interchangeably. And you have the case Phelan that supports that. Then you have but C, and it's talking about a different circuit that says discussing conflict among circuits as to whether the terms are interchangeable. So it lets the reader know that generally this circuit may not actually be all of that circuit and that other circuits disagree. You can also use contra. Contra is used when the cited authority directly states the contrary proposition. So contra would be used comparably if you cited a case in direct support, which means there wouldn't be a signal. Contra is the opposite of that. So you have C, People v. Hilt, finding that empty, torn, knotted piece of baggie in plain view gave officer probable cause. Then you have a contra to Commonwealth versus Garcia, holding that plain view observation of empty plastic baggie on rear floor of vehicle did not give probable cause. So they are directly in opposition to one another. So again, we talked through all of the signals that indicate support. There are other signals. There's the signals for useful comparison. There's 3 signals that indicate contradiction, and there's signals that indicate background material. When using introductory signals in a string cite, remember the punctuation that we just talked about. Remember whether or not you use the signal lowercase or uppercase or capitalized instead of uppercase, so that you can create your string cites. So here, using signals in a string cite, we have one case, Ashton, which directly supports the proposition. We have a C also, Ferraria, which means that it also supports the proposition, but you have no intention of using that case in the rest of your paper. You have a CF, Jackson, and then you start a new sentence with a but C, and of course the B of but is capitalized because it's the start of a new sentence. Remember that when you're using those other signals, it would be recommended that you have a parenthetical so the explanation I'm giving you would make more sense, and so that the reader would understand what these all do. You don't want to do something like this where you have the first case that supported proposition and then you capitalize C also and have a semicolon for CF and then add the but C. So just make sure that you are consistent with the type of punctuation you're using between your cases and your signals and the capitalization that you're using between your case and your signals. So we're going to review these. So if you have C and you have a chord, what would be the difference between the two? What punctuation would you use between the two? And the punctuation you would use between the two would be a semicolon because they are from the same classification of signals. They are both signals in support. If you have C also and contra, what type of punctuation would you use? Well, here you would use a period because one is a signal indicating support and one is a signal indicating contradiction, that it goes against the proposition that you're making. And C generally, again, there would be a period here because C is a signal that is in direct support, whereas C generally is the fourth type of signal on your list, which is a signal that indicates background material. And finally, between E period, G period, and CF, you would have a semicolon because both of these indicate support. If you have any questions, please post it in either the open forum discussion on the Canvas page or ask me and Stella directly, and we can help you along your way. The next thing we are going to move on to is explanatory parentheticals. All right, on to explanatory parentheticals. When you read this quote, what do the citations tell you about the rule? If the rule is to be reasonable, a non-competition clause must be limited in duration and scope. And you have Hawkins saying limiting the enforcement of a non-competition clause to one country, and Igo saying finding a non-competition clause enforceable for the duration of 10 years. What do the citations tell you? Well, you know from the citations that because there's not any signals in front of it, that both of those cases stand for the proposition that was just stated. What happens here is the explanatory parenthetical shows you that the writers synthesized the principles from both cases to create one overall rule regarding the reasonableness of a non-competition clause. So when you use parentheticals, you're actually using them to bring out the more positive cases and to explain the negative cases. So here you have the courts have found that a police officer who is working a sting operation is not in the process of executing a legal duty, but rather is merely on the job. And you see the cite to J. Please note that these cases are in Blue Book format, not in Rule 9.800 format. And J directly stands for that proposition. You see a C also citing to DG, which says holding that defendant's verbal protests and refusal to answer questions during a police investigation did not obstruct justice because the officers were merely on the job, which shows support for that proposition and also explains a little bit about what you're talking about. And then you have a but C, and you have Porter, and now it's explaining holding that defendants yelling of certain code words obstructed police officers involved in a sting operation. So you know that if they're doing something that could make other people run away, that you may be obstructing a police officer's involvement as opposed to a police officer merely being on the job. So they help to bring out the more positive cases and they explain cases that the other side may be using. And you've already distinguished that case to show why that is not applicable to your general proposition. When you're going to use a parenthetical, it should be inserted into the citation where it applies, which means it's part of the same citation sentence. In the citation, the parenthetical information should follow the parentheses that contains the date and the court information, and there should be a space between, but no punctuation between the two. If the case citation includes subsequent history, then the parenthetical information would precede the subsequent history. But that's another story. Here we go. So here, when you have subsequent history, why would you use subsequent history? Well, if the case is rather new, you would need to use subsequent history. If the case has been overruled, you would need subsequent history. But here, so you see lay shock, you have the whole site. Then the parenthetical starts holding that in a student's claim of free speech violation, the burden is on the school to prove that it had the authority to punish the student. Then your subsequent history is affirmed with the case cite and the Third Circuit case that affirmed the Western District of Pennsylvania's opinion. For short cites, the parenthetical comes at the end of the cite. So here you have Thomas with the cite and the parenthetical follows. There is a space between the page number and the start of the parenthetical. Same if you were using id, there's a space between the page number and where you start the parenthetical. How do you draft an explanatory parenthetical? Well, you start with a present participle. Present participle is a verb ending in ing. The present participle should be about what the court is doing, not what the parties did in the case. So common present participles for what the court did would be finding, holding, reasoning, ruling, all of the things that a court normally does would be the present participle that you're looking for. Please note, courts do not believe, so believing would not be a present participle that you want to use. There are two exceptions to the present participle rule. The first exception is where the explanatory parenthetical is going to enumerate a series of examples set up by the text of a sentence. Oh, Professor Cleon, what the heck does that mean? Well, here you go. Such standards have been adopted to address a variety of environmental problems. Your setup is a variety of environmental problems. Then you have your cite, and you will note inside the explanatory parentheticals, you have health-related water quality and conservation of protected areas. So that is the first exception to having an explanatory parenthetical start with a present participle. The second is when the parenthetical information consists of a full sentence quote from the applicable case. That means that the parenthetical starts with the quote itself. So you have all of this information, another factor federal courts consider, blah, 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 blah. You get to the cite and you see the quote starting based on the fact that a transfer to New Jersey would only serve, and it goes through the whole quote. Here, I want you to note that because the quote was an entire sentence, there is a period inside the parenthetical and then the quotation mark. But there is also a period after the explanatory parenthetical because it is ending the citation sentence that started with KTEL. Moving further into the guidelines for your explanatory parenthetical. After the present participle, make sure that the present participle is a lowercase letter. After the lowercase letter, make sure that you provide specific facts. Because the parenthetical should provide the reader with an illustration of the rule, it should refer to the specific facts of the case cited. However, because the reader will not necessarily read the case, the facts should be stated in general terms. But the parenthetical should not be so general that it merely restates the general rule, but it should not require reading the case to be understood. After the facts, you want to provide context, which means that the substance of the parenthetical should be given specific context. The information should explain what the court decided in the context of the general legal proposition that you are discussing in the text of your memo. You should limit the parenthetical to one sentence. It is not if it's not possible to explain what you want from this case using a single sentence, then you might want to consider not using an explanatory parenthetical, but putting the case actually in the text of your memo. And other than what I showed you for a direct quotation, there is no ending punctuation inside the explanatory parenthetical. The punctuation comes on the outside to close the citation sentence. Common mistakes when putting things inside parentheticals is to merely restate the rule in the parenthetical, or to put the rule in the parenthetical and not actually in the text. So here you have another factor this court considers in determining whether the prolonged pretrial detention of a criminal defendant violates his due process rights is the complexity of the case. Then you have your parenthetical, and you have holding that if the delay of trial is attributable to the complexity of a case as opposed to the misconduct or inaction of the prosecution, the extended pretrial detention of the defendant is not a violation of due process. Well, here the entire rule is inside the explanatory parenthetical. The first sentence actually acted as just a transition, and the rule itself was in the parenthetical. This is not good because things that are included in explanatory parentheticals are not text, which means they should not be relied on in your application. Your application should rely on text, not on information inside parentheticals. Here is the first thing that I talked about, which was restating the rule in a parenthetical, which means that the parenthetical is duplicative of the text that you just gave. So here you have another factor this court considers in determining whether the prolonged pretrial detention of a criminal defendant violates his due process right is the complexity of the case. This court has held that if the delay in bringing a defendant to trial is attributable to the complexity of the case as opposed to the misconduct or inaction of the prosecution, this factor will support a finding that the extended pretrial detention of the defendant is not a violation of due process. Then it gives a parenthetical that says, holding that if the delay of bringing a defendant to trial is attributable to the complexity of the case, this factor will support a finding that the extended pretrial detention of the defendant is not a violation of due process. If you look at that, you will see that they basically say the exact same thing. So the parenthetical is not adding anything new. It is not explaining the text. It is merely repeating yourself. Another common mistake would be to use overly broad terms, which means that the reader themselves would not necessarily understand what purpose the parenthetical means. So here, another factor this court considers in determining whether the prolonged pretrial detention of a criminal defendant violates his due process rights is the complexity of the case. This court has held, you've heard that rule before, and then the parenthetical simply says, finding that because the case was of a complex nature, the prolonged verbal detention of the defendant did not violate his due process rights. That adds nothing to the rule. It doesn't explain it any further. It just basically says, see this case, it does what I just said. There are other common mistakes. One is using overly specific terms so that you are explaining the case with such specificity that it can't be applied to any other case. Another one would be to have an explanatory parenthetical that is overly long, which would make it unreadable. And since your parenthetical is only supposed to be a single sentence, it would make it probably grammatically incorrect. Another one would be to omit articles. If you are reading some older cases and reading head notes, you will note that back in the 80s, early 90s, it was very often done by the people that wrote the head notes to omit articles. And it was also taught to law clerks in those days to omit articles from your explanatory parentheticals. If you are trying to paraphrase those, you would want to omit articles. Do not do that. Professor Cleon, what's an article? An article is a, an, or the that you put before words. Although omitting an article may save space and may save words, it is very distracting for the reader and should not be done. And finally, starting your parenthetical with a gerund. Here you have Kane Furniture, and the parenthetical starts, supplying his own installation equipment and performing his work supported a finding that a carpet installer was an independent contractor. Well, supplying is actually operating is for the word supply. And in this example, you're talking about what the carpet installer was doing as opposed to what the court was doing. If you talked about the court and said, finding that because a carpet installer supplied his own installation equipment in performing his work, the factor supported a finding that he was an independent contractor, you would have not had the issue of using a gerund. So when do you use parentheticals? Well, you use parentheticals to prove a rule. If you provided a paraphrased rule, you could use a parenthetical to prove a rule by providing the quote from the court. You can use a parenthetical to prove an extracted rule, which means that you're going to talk about how you came up with your rule by explaining what happened in the lower case. Remember, C means that it doesn't stand directly for that proposition. So the parenthetical information is explaining basically how you got to that rule. You can use parentheticals to prove a synthesized rule by citing the rules that you use to help synthesize, and then explain what those cases meant that brought you to your synthesized rule. Sorry, my computer just decided to stop there. You can use parentheticals to counter or distinguish adverse authorities. So you have the two cases relied on by the government are factually distinguishable because each case involved a second search based on a valid warrant. The second search was independent of the initial illegal search. And then you have a C, and it provides brief explanation of the facts in that case. You can also use parentheticals in your application. You can use it after you've applied the governing rule. It could be a way to remind the reader of what you're talking about. You can use it after you state the relief that you want from the court to prove that other courts have granted the same relief that you're asking for. So those are signals and explanatory parentheticals. Please remember that explanatory parentheticals are going to be graded in your final closed memorandum. So if you have any questions, please make sure you come and ask me or the TA. And I will see everybody next time. Have a good one.